boys drop out of high school. Before COVID, more than 20% of boys who had dropped out of high school were unemployed in their early 20s. And so usually boys who are unemployed, their testosterone gets channeled very destructively rather than constructively. And the boys feel a lack of purpose and a lack of structure, and they become very rudderless. And those are the boys that are much more likely to be destructive and not desired by girls. Girls don't marry boys in unemployment lines or boys who are living in their parents' cellars. And so this is why that boy crisis is also very important for our daughters. I have 2 daughters, and John Gray, the co-author of The Boy Crisis, has 3 daughters, and we want our daughters to have sons who are worthy of their love. Even if you're a lesbian, you still want men at work to be able to be constructive, productive, have a high level of emotional intelligence, and so on. And so that's just the education area. In the mental health area, at the age of 9, boys and girls rarely commit suicide. But when they do, they commit them at an equal rate. Between the ages of 10 and 14, boys commit suicide twice as often as girls do. Between the ages of 15 and 19, 4 times as often as girls do. Between the ages of 20 and 25, 5.2 or 3 times as likely to commit suicide. And the biggest single predictor of suicide or mental health problems in general is dad deprivation. I'll get into the importance of dad deprivation in a moment. For physical health, boys are far more likely to be obese. Back to the mental health area, they're more likely to be depressed, take drugs as a result of the depression, become addicted to video games, to porn, to opioids, and deaths from opioids are more than twice as frequent with boys than they are girls. And so we have this whole series of problems, and this is not just in the United States. In England, they did a study showing that the male IQ no less, has dropped 15% in the last generation, whereas historically speaking, IQs have always gone up with each generation. Male life expectancy has gone down 3 years in a row, even though life expectancy, as in every other demographic, has gone up each year, or at least remained the same each year. And so there's just dozens and dozens of problems that are happening, not just in the United States, but I'm afraid all over the developed world, not the undeveloped world. That's a different issue. But the developed world has had these problems of the boy crisis in all 56 of the largest developed nations.
Wow. Yeah, that's amazing. When you talk about education, there is a boy crisis, and you've given probably just a snippet of all the things that point to it. I think it was Prager University about 5 or 10 years ago that did a study that showed that our education system is almost designed more for women and girls than it is for boys. Have you found that to be true?
Absolutely. And a person also who has done good work on this issue is Michael Gurian and Leonard Sachs in Boys Adrift. And all 3 of us have found that and I used to teach and did student teaching. I have a propensity, as you probably know, like I used to do men's beauty contests and role reversal dates. So I was teaching political science, and I would have Republicans, we would mimic a convention, a political convention, and we have Republicans in one convention and Democrats in the other. And then we'd have them argue do their studies and argue points of view. And then I would surprise them and have them all reverse roles. And then that led to my doing role reversal dates and men's beauty contests to get men and women to walk a mile in each other's moccasins. And so that was this getting people involved and understanding each other in that way was very crucial to me. I'm realizing I forgot your original question because I looked at something else there. Repeat your question again, Michael.
So the original question is how did we get, it's clear we do have a boy crisis. Your book outlines the hundreds of evidentiary points. But how did we even get here to begin with?
We got here in a very interesting and complex way. Throughout all of history, every generation had its war. And with each war, we realized that we needed people to be willing to die in that war. And so we trained men. We said to men, look at Uncle Joe. He was in the Marines and he died in the Marines, and he's really honored by our family. And so boys received social bribes to be disposable, which is why in The Myth of Male Power, the subtitle of that book is Why Men Are the Disposable Sex. And our role as men was not to be privileged, not to be entitled, not to have power, but to be disposable, to be willing, so that the entire society, in order to not have to worry about being under Nazi rule, could depend on bribing men, say you will be loved, approved of, you will be called a hero, you will be honored, or your family will honor you, women will love you if you're an officer and a gentleman rather than a private pacifist. Or if you take those risks and be willing to die, you will be loved more, honored more. Your parents don't want you to die, but they want you to be able to be part of defending the country. If you didn't go to war, it would be fine if you also were the sole breadwinner. Historically speaking, men had to be willing to be disposable in war or disposable at work. When I say disposable at work, what I mean is that historically speaking, men are often in hazardous professions. So 93% of the people who die in hazardous professions are male. They learn to work very hard, long hours to get to the top of some ladder that they're told will be, that they receive the social bribe to say, this is power. Millennials in Japan are beginning to recognize this. They have something called karoshi in Japan. Karoshi is a Japanese word that means death from overwork or death at the desk. The millennials in Japan have a game called karoshi, and each person gets a karoshi figure, and you try to win the game by getting to the top of the corporate ladder and being the first person to get to the top of the ladder. And then the first person to get to the top of the ladder is the winner. So he commits suicide. And he doesn't commit suicide in real life. He commits it in the game. And the purpose of the game is to help people understand, and because Japanese millennials are understanding that this game that my father learned to play, that's called power, is really feeling obligated to earn money that someone else spends while you die sooner. This is a game that basically kills you. So rather than dying, working 60, 70, 80 hours a week, oftentimes in places like Japan and Tokyo, when I was over there with one of my books, I saw, most of the men would stay, the top level men would stay in the city from Monday through Thursday or from Tuesday to Thursday and only see their families on the weekends. So they were just isolated from the families. When we came home, they didn't feel like they had the comfort of being able to talk to their wives. So they'd have special things called snacks, where on the way home, they would stop and talk to a woman who was hired just to speak with them and listen to them about their day's work so their wife wouldn't have to be bothered with it. And so we got there because all of this, historically, we were trained to be disposable. The bad news, and the good news was that it gave us purpose. The bad news, and what's happened recently, or the last 50 years or so, is that we need fewer soldiers in war. So men are needed less to die. That's good news for obvious reasons. It's also bad news because men lost their purpose. The second thing that happened is that women were sharing the breadwinner burdens and responsibilities. So being a sole breadwinner was no longer so clear as an identifier for being a male. And then a third huge factor happened. All of these 56 largest developed nations, especially the United States and the most developed nations like the US, England, Australia, etc., had enough mastery of survival in the middle and upper middle class that the society could give permission for there to be divorces. And divorces led to the lack of father involvement. And there was also permission to raise children without being married, which usually meant a lack of father involvement also. And so what I discovered when I did the research for the boy crisis, that it was in these two demographics, boys without father involvement, as a result of the society giving permission for children to not have fathers, that these were the boys that were the ISIS recruits, that were the criminals. Your jail is filled with 93, jails are filled with 90, prisons are filled with 93% males. Of those 93% males, about 85 to 90% are dad-deprived males. And the ISIS recruits, as I was saying, are almost all dad-deprived males. Also females, by the way, that are ISIS recruits are much more likely to be dad-deprived. Our mass shooters are to a very high degree dad-deprived males. 100% of the mass shooters since the 21st century who have killed 10 or more people have been dad-deprived boys.
So we've been trained to become expendable, to become disposable, whether it's in war, whether it's at basically sacrificing our lives for a career to provide for other people that we won't even be around practically. And therefore we've been deprived of being fathers, of being the co-parent in the family setting.
And I wanted to ask you too, Mr. Farrell, thank you for being here. I'm T. Greg Squires. I'm the program chair for Boys to Men USA. And one of the things that we are, speaking what you're talking about, military, one of the things that I think can be appealing for young men is that there is a rite of passage that is involved with that culture of the military, of going through basic. I had a conversation with a gentleman the other day. I was talking to him about the summit, and he told me, he said, yeah, I wanted to do that more than anything. I wanted to go fight in the war, and I wanted to prove himself and all of that stuff. So I'm wondering if you could speak, because we at Boys to Men found that having a group of men witness boys is having an impact. Witnessing them on their journey is, and many of these boys are fatherless, but just simply the men of the tribe, the uncles, the elders showing up and witnessing to those boys on that ride of becoming a man has done a lot of work in healing some of these rifts of pointlessness and despair and all of the things that you mentioned. Can you speak to that at all? Rites of passage?
Absolutely. Rites of passage are very helpful. And historically speaking, in a way, men did have rites of passage. And for example, the more warrior-oriented the society, the more the society felt it needed to defend itself, the more likely it was to wait till the age of 13 or 14 for a boy to be circumcised. And then the boy would be brought out in the middle of the village, and everybody would stand around, and he would become a man if naked in front of the village. He was circumcised, cut on his penis, and he didn't wince. But if he winced, he was not a man. And so what we were preparing boys for historically is different types of rites of passage to be able to serve the way the society needed them to serve. Historically speaking, the father was involved with the child, and so there was really multiple rites of passage. The technical rite of passage was the type of ceremony, or some version of it, like I was talking about. But the real rite of passage, the real development of maturity in a boy came from not any event, but came from a constant involvement, seeing, observing, and being honored and loved and being disciplined by his fathers. So we often say that mothers have unconditional approval. We don't say the same thing about dads. We say mothers have unconditional love. We often don't say that dads have unconditional love, but in fact, both moms and dads have unconditional love, but dads tend to have more conditional approval. And that's one of their ways of loving. So one of the reasons why so many boys who are fatherless are not having all those moments in their life filled in with how to be honored, how to achieve, is because one of the big things that tends to be missing when their father is not around is postponed gratification, is boundary enforcement. I'll explain what I mean by that. So, for example, both the father and the mother care and love their children and would probably give their lives most of the time for their children. But a mom will oftentimes be focused on the nurturing and the protecting, and the dad might, for example, be more like in a roughhouse, or be more likely to say, if you got 3 B's and an A, but you need to move those 3 B's up, and if you don't, there won't be any dessert or whatever. And mom will say, that's awfully mean. He got 3 B's and an A. That was good. But the big difference is in the difference between moms and dads. One of the biggest difference is the difference in boundary enforcement. So, for example, most people get boundary setting and boundary enforcement mixed up. So moms and dads are both good at setting boundaries. They say things like, you can't have your ice cream until you finish your peas. Children are extremely good at challenging those boundaries, trying to have as few peas as possible before they get their ice cream. But the difference between moms and dads tends to be, and sometimes this is reversed, tends to be that moms will, if the child says, gee, I had a bad day at work, or a bad day at school, somebody bullied me, or something bad happened, mom will think to herself, gee, I don't want to get into a big argument over a few peas. So I'll tell you what, sweetie, tonight, you should have your peas before you have your ice cream, but tonight because you've been through such a bad day, I'll let you have your ice cream without having anything more than this number of peas. So then the child gets half that number of peas finished, and mom goes, all right, now he's at least tried. Okay, have your ice cream. The child does the same thing with the dad, and dad is much more likely to say, excuse me, we have a deal here. The deal here is you can't have your ice cream until you finish your peas. That's not negotiable. You agreed to it, and I agreed to it. Oh, daddy, you're so mean. And mom and dad will ultimately usually say, if you're going to cry and complain like that, there'll be no ice cream tomorrow night either. Eventually the boy gets the point. With dad, I've got to finish doing what I need to do in order to get what I want to have, the ice cream. And so what the child is learning there is postponed gratification. What the child is learning with the mother is as a rule, and again, this could be reversed, is to manipulate a better deal. And so when we do studies of children with mothers, and especially boys, we find that the mothers experience the boys as being, and the girls too, as being coercive, as being manipulative, and much more likely to have ADHD. Children raised predominantly by their moms, 30% have ADHD. Children raised predominantly by their dads, only 15% have ADHD, partially because the father is much more willing to enforce boundaries. And when he enforces boundaries, that allows the child who will be encouraged to dream by the mom and by the dad to be a great musician or be an Olympic star or whatever that child's gifts are. But when a child without discipline, without postponed gratification, goes to try to become that actor, that basketball player, or that scholar, without the discipline, the child fails at achieving the dream that the mother and father have nurtured. And so one of the functions of fathers in the family is to provide that boundary enforcement, to say, no, bedtime was 9 o'clock. You didn't get your homework done. I'm sorry. That's going to be on you. Bedtime is 9 o'clock. And not be able to manipulate the dad into, you don't want me to go to school without doing my homework, do you? And mom will go, no, I don't. Much more likely to go, no, I don't. Therefore, and then the child will learn, I can always manipulate a better bedtime. And so the concrete data shows that children who are growing up with under dad's supervision they have later bedtimes that are set than when they're with moms, that they actually get to bed earlier because of what dad requires, and what dad requires the child to not have what she or he wants to have unless they do what they need to do first. And so these types of involvements also create things that are just very counterintuitive. When dads roughhouse with children, they will often stop the roughhousing when they see one child is hurting the other. And so from that roughhousing, the kids learn that they have to think of their sisters and brothers' needs. Otherwise, they'll lose what they want to have, the roughhousing, if they don't think of somebody else besides themselves. And so studies with children that roughhouse with dads find the children to be both more empathetic, greater social skills, and obviously children who are more empathetic and have greater social skills get along with their peers a lot better. They're much more likely to be constructive rather than destructive. They're likely not to withdraw into drugs or video games or alcohol. They're much more likely to be successful, and therefore successful with women if they're men, they're boys. And so all of these things come from father involvement that virtually nobody knows about. And one of the reasons I put so much emphasis in the Boy Crisis book on the differences between dad's parenting style and mom's parenting style, because mom's parenting style, moms oftentimes think that dad's parenting style is irresponsible, like roughhousing or dangerous, and without understanding all the dynamics that go into roughhousing. And moms aren't to blame because moms can't hear what dads don't say. And dads aren't to blame because when I did studies of parenting magazines, these different styles of dad styles and what the benefits were to the children, they also were not included. So dads don't understand these things. And so that was one of the inspirations for writing the Boy Crisis book.
Wow, thank you for that. That's such a detailed response to how we got here in the first place, and the perpetuation of dads being excluded in the co-parenting roles. So where are we now with the state of our boys mentally? What's the average teenage boy's mental crisis right now?
Without the boys who are fatherless have enormous problems because they don't have that they don't have that boundary enforcement. Therefore, they don't have the postponed gratification. And so the boy crisis really is a crisis of fatherlessness. When I submitted the original proposal to my publisher, I had 10 causes of the boy crisis. And then I started seeing, for example, boys that grow up in feminized homes with only, say, the mom in the home, and then they go to schools and there's no male teachers. They're very vulnerable to being drafted by a gang or drafted or a drug dealer to get some sense of family, to get some sense of purpose, to get some sense of belonging, and so on. And Hitler's Hitler Youth Organization used to look for boys without dads because they were so vulnerable and so in need of a dad. And so there was an enormous propensity on the part of boys without dads to feel really this lack of purpose. And again, I got off on that track, and the original.
Yeah, I was talking about the mental state. So it sounds that they lack a deep sense of belonging. It sounds like they are. I think Daryl Moment in the chat wrote how the boys he's working with are lacking a sense of purpose and looking for what's their role in life in this modern life.
And the reason for the lack of the sense of purpose is, remember, the two senses of purpose we had historically, to be sole breadwinners and to be soldiers, that was replaced when those have disappeared. And then there becomes a purpose void. And that's all boys today experience an overall potential purpose void. But the good news of the purpose void is boys are no longer put into a purpose straitjacket. You must be a soldier. You must be a sole breadwinner. That's the good news. The bad news is they need to discover, the bad and good news is they have an opportunity to discover their purpose, but discovering your purpose, like seeing that you really have a gift. And my gift was I had good legs and I was a strong runner and football kicker. And so and my other gift was in math. And my father was an accountant and he's helped me see that I had a gift in math. But it wasn't good enough that I just had that gift. I was required to have to do well in math and to put my time in, and in order to manifest that. And so when boys have only moms, they tend to have their purpose very much nurtured and identified and protected, but they oftentimes don't have that boundary enforcement to get the postponed gratification that's necessary to achieve that purpose. So here we have boys generationally who have an opportunity to have any purpose that is part of their unique self. Mom and dad are both usually very good at helping their children discover their unique self. That's a privilege we have for today's boys that historically boys have never had. That's a great gift. But if they don't have that boundary enforcement to achieve that purpose, then they feel more like failures, because every time they dream and tell their friends, I'm going to do this, I'm going to do that, I'm going to be a star in this play, I'm going to be a star on the basketball team, I'm going to get straight A's, I'm going to be a part of the honor society, and they fail at those things, they start becoming ashamed. And that leads to the withdrawal and the drugs and the addictions and so on. And so that's why you have this, that's one of the reasons you have this series of problems. The second is that we in the feminist movement really misinterpreted what history was about. We have been through the civil rights movement, in which there was an oppressor and an oppressed, and then through Marxism, in which there was an oppressor and an oppressed, and the oppressors earned more money than the oppressed. And so we saw, men earn more money than women do, therefore they are the oppressors and women are the oppressed. And that was a total misinterpretation. And that led to statements like, men have male privilege, they're entitled, they think that they could be at the top of the game. But they didn't realize that men, at least today, in the last 20, 30 years, men do not earn more money than women do. Dads earn more money than moms do. And what happens when there are children is if the dads learn that they don't have the option to be a musician because it doesn't pay enough, or a starving artist. The reason starving comes before artists is for obvious reasons. They don't have an option to be the elementary school teacher anymore. If their wife has 1, 2, or 3 children, if they and their wife have 1, 2, or 3 children, and the mom wants to be home with the children or only work part-time, they have to compensate for that and therefore give up being an elementary school teacher, become that principal or a superintendent of schools instead, without anyone asking, which would you prefer to be, a teacher or an administrator? 90 some odd percent of people would prefer to be a teacher if you took away the status part of it. And so the status was men's way of giving up doing what created the glint in their eyes, doing what we wanted to do, to give our children and to give our wives a better home and a better community with better schools, and to give our children options that we never had for ourselves. And all of that, those were the sacrifices my father made and almost all fathers made throughout history. And moms made equivalent sacrifices also. They risked their lives in childbirth, and they made sacrifices of their careers. Men made sacrifices in their careers. And we in the feminist movement, we put all the focus on women's sacrifices and made the false assumption that men had the world figured out in such a way that manipulated women into their sacrifices without making, and we had privilege and power because we were at the top of the economic ladder without any understanding of what it took to get there, and the fact that for each person at the top of that ladder, there are many people at the bottom of that ladder, and that the homeless are also mostly males, and the ones that commit suicide and die earlier are also males. And the feminist movement to this day, unfortunately, does not understand that, get that, or acknowledge that. And that's been a deep sadness for me because almost every friend I had who was a feminist went out for many years.
So we're talking about the mental landscape of what boys are going through. Can you speak to a little bit about this, what's happening to them physically, their physical health? And
yeah. Boys, when boys don't have that sense of purpose, they get bored. And then there's food. And when they get a little bit older, drinking. And then there's drugs, and especially in inner cities where not only do you get drugs, but you're also one of those ways of making easy money, or easy money for a while, is to sell drugs. And so you get into a whole system of people that are destructive and that are likely to lead to prison, and hence the school to prison pipeline. And what we need to, and one of the reasons, as you mentioned, that Joe and Michael, you've both worked with me on the coalition to create the White House Council on Boys and Men. That one of the reasons we wish to create a White House Council on Boys and Men, and other councils on boys and men around the country in different states and communities, is because boys need to be we need to have programs to to have scholarships for male teachers in exchange for spending a couple of years teaching. We need to have a father warrior programs. This is part of what I've discussed with the White House, is creating a father warrior program in which we work with boys at the age of 5, 6 years of age to have better communication skills, more emotional intelligence, become babysitters, caretakers for their sisters, to prepare themselves to be good, involved dads, and to be honoring them for that. One of the most important things to understand about men is that men will do anything if you honor them. Men are very vulnerable to social bribes. We as a society just have to be conscious of being responsible with our social bribes, and to use the part of everybody's brain, which is the RCZ, the rostral cingulate zone, which when we honor a boy or a girl, the rostral cingulate zone part of our brain shoots us dopamine, the feel-good drug, and that makes us want to do what gives us approval. And we'll say to boys, well, you will be loved, honored, and respected as a father, because what we need in this world now is good fathers and good scout leaders and good boys to men mentors and good people in faith-based communities to lead boys effectively. And we need to not only get, and what does effectively mean? It means responsible guidance where we teach boys how to communicate their vulnerabilities to each other. And not every boy is walking around and what Ashanti Branch calls the mask of masculinity, and what I also call the mask of masculinity, which is you manifest one vision of yourself to your friends, but underneath you feel insecure and you feel ashamed of yourself, and you don't feel like you're as good as other people, but you can't share that with anybody. And so all of that gets internalized and built up until it comes out in a destructive and negative way. And so these are, and by the way, I'll spend one moment deviating here. If you're a mom listening to this conference is open to moms?
Of course.
Yes, okay, I was quite sure. And if you're a mom listening to this and you're a single mom, I really want to not go further without making sure that I give you some sense of what can be done constructively. We have really hard data that I talk about in the Boy Crisis book on what the value of Cub Scouts is to boys' character development. And I don't know of a single mom that doesn't care about developing boys' character really constructively and well. So get involved, study why it's the case. Boy Scouts, aside from all the controversy that they're in, nevertheless has constructed merit badges in ways that boys can achieve that are very honorable and constructive. So don't avoid the Boy Scouts. Get involved with faith-based communities. Make sure your boys get involved, and your girls too, in what I call the liberal arts of sports. Each type of sport has a gift to give to your child. One of those is team sports. The other one is pickup team sports, which is the most neglected form of sports, where you teach boys to become and girls to become entrepreneurs by having them go to a school, for example, and pick up a game with other kids that come into the area at that time, make up rules. So you're not having supervision, which prepares you well for organizations, but pickup team sports prepares you to be an entrepreneur, to be a risk taker, to create rules, and to judge for yourself what rules are being followed and not followed. And then also sports that are not quite team sports, like basketball, gymnastics, where you're part of a larger team, but most of the work is individual work, but that's very good for self-starting. And it's very important for children, and especially for boys, to have all three of those, because one of your questions before was, are schools feminized? And yes, they are, because girls are much better than boys are as a rule at taking notes, memorizing them, or making sense to them and feeding them back on an exam. Boys learn by doing. When I got off before about talking about getting everybody into different role reversal experiences at school, it was that I intuitively sensed that the children would learn better by doing. What I didn't realize was what my teacher supervisors told me afterwards, is that a number of the boys in class who were pretty bright but had been doing very badly, for some reason that group of boys did exceptionally well. I didn't realize what I was doing at the time, but my propensity to teach by having people do was good for the girls, but it was especially good for those boys that were not the student type of boys.
Wow, yeah, that makes complete sense. It's in Boys to Men mentoring, sports and games and interactive games are a big part of what we do in our J groups. What should we be? Thanks for telling us, how do we get there? Where are we now? Where are we going? What should Boys to Men mentoring be doing in our work with boys? What you've talked about, some tools that moms can use. What about our mentors? And not every boy has access to a father, whether it's through divorce. A lot of our boys' fathers are in the justice system. If you mentioned 93% of all incarcerated Americans are male. What do you recommend? What do you see that we're doing well? And what do you think we could do even better?
What you're doing well is you are providing, Boys to Men mentoring is providing one of the most important gaps in the culture at this point, because obviously they'll be focusing on boys who need that. And boys, there's never been a time when as high a percentage of boys are without dads, and their boys are yearning for male role models that are constructive. And when they don't get them, boys who are without their dads hurt, and hurt boys hurt us. If they don't have a mentor to give them good male role modeling and to see that somebody cares about them, that hurt will almost invariably go into channeling their testosterone destructively. So you are providing, in my opinion, one of the most essential missing ingredients in boys' lives. Secondly, what can potentially you do better? I don't know whether you're doing this already, but one of the things I was quite surprised and interested to find as I did the research for the boy book was that boys are helped both by mentors and even more helped by being mentors. So working with boys to find somebody even younger than they are who is not doing well and needs their help, or can potentially use their help, and working with them to mentor that boy, it turns the boy into a sort of a mini parent. he begins to, whereas normally he would maybe not want to study and get involved in some new video game, get addicted to that. And he's now saying to himself, if I get involved in that video game, I'm not going to do as well at school. How will that look to the boy that I'm mentoring when I get an F or a D? How will it look to the boy that I'm mentoring if I drop out of school? How will it look to the boy I'm mentoring if I take drugs, if I get arrested? And so he's having a purpose. We were talking about the purpose void before. So the boy needs the mentorship from above, but seems to benefit even more when that mentor helps him find somebody to mentor that he can become a mini dad for and feel always watching himself through the way the boy will potentially feel he can respect him. I'm not sure if you know the data on this, but 53% of women under 30 who have children in the United States have children without being married. Without being married means usually, even when the small percentage of them that are living with a man at the time, the ones that are living with a man at the time, the average relationship lasts only 3 years. And then usually the dad disappears, oftentimes completely from the child's life after that. And so this point in history with that enormous amount of the percentage of boys growing up without a male role model, which is so important. Girls don't hurt as much because they at least have a female role model at home with the single mom. And they also have much more permission to cry and to express their feelings. Boys have learned to repress their feelings and especially have an interest in being successful. They learn at an early age that successful men don't express their feelings, they repress their feelings. And so when you don't have a male role model and you don't have any social permission to express what's going on inside of you, what's churning, it soon becomes a volcano that can explode and hurt the very boy that is hurting so much. We talk a great deal about haters, and the men's rights community is considered haters. But I'd like us to always see that the hater, and you indicated a minute ago, the ones that are the interrupters we're talking about, it's so often the people who are destructive, who are the haters, who are actually ones who are hurting the most. Mm-hmm. And we have to understand that anger is vulnerability's mask. And whenever we see that anger, just look for the vulnerability. And it won't take but a little bit of effort and a little bit of listening, a little listening without contradicting, arguing, that will allow that boy to begin to express the vulnerability that created that anger. Once heard and understood, he becomes open to a type of guidance he might not have been